All right, let's start chapter 2 with the first section, 2.2, conditional statements. A conditional is any sentence written as an if-then statement. They are made up of a hypothesis and conclusion. Kind of like science, you hear those words. The part after the if is the hypothesis, and after the then is the conclusion. All right, so let's practice. Let's underline the hypothesis and circle the conclusion. So the part after the if is the hypothesis, so don't underline the if, just the part after and up until the then, and then we will circle everything that is after the then. All right, so we've got our hypothesis is it rains, and our conclusion is you will need an umbrella. Now go ahead and try the second one, underlining the hypothesis and circling the conclusion. All right, you should have gotten this. An angle measures 43 degrees as the hypothesis, and it is acute as the conclusion. Now, we'll go to our types of conditionals. There are 4 types. I call the conditional the original. It rhymes, and that's a good way of remembering it. The symbols for that, we would have a statement P, we put an arrow, and we go to Q. That arrow means it's a conditional statement or an if-then. That is right down here at the bottom under your table if you want to circle or highlight that. All right? If you have an arrow, that means it's a conditional statement. So an example of a conditional statement would be, if you're at school, then you're at WBHS. All right, notice it's an if and a then. We have a hypothesis and a conclusion. The next is a converse, where you switch the order. So the original, conditional original was P to Q, so now the converse is Q to P. If you want to make a note that this is where you switch, go ahead and do that. So the example, we're going to use the same example, we're just going to switch the order. So instead, now my conclusion is going to become my hypothesis. So now it will say, if you're at WBHS, then you're at school. Okay, so the order of my sentence changed. Next is inverse. Inverse means opposite. You guys know the word inverse, so it's kind of how it's going to be used here. We will talk about not P to not Q. These are all types of conditionals, so they still have that arrow. And that little squiggle, which is right here at the bottom, if you want to highlight this, means not, or we can really call it opposite of, like inverses or opposites. Okay, we can even call that negate. That's how it's going to be used sometimes too. So the order did not change from our original. It's still P and then Q, but this is not P to not Q. So when we do our example, it will say, if you're not at school, so the school part is still first like my original, but now it says if you're not at school, then you're not at WBHS. All right? And the last one is contrapositive. For the contrapositive, you switch the order and you negate. Okay? So we'll put both. The way I like to remember this is contrapositive, the longest word, so you have the most to do. You've got to do all of it, switch and negate. All right, so this one would say, if you're not at WBHS, then you're not at school. Okay? So all we did, we took the inverse and switched the order because we needed to have nots and we needed to switch it. So these statements, are they true? They could be. If you're at school, then you're at WBHS. Well, maybe you go to Burton. That's still school. So it's not necessarily whether it is true, and when you switch things up, that truth value changes, which we will get into. But you've got to know how they change. So converse, you switch. Inverse, you negate. And contrapositive, you do both. All right. Sometimes you have to rewrite statements in the if-then form. This is called writing a conditional. So, an example, if you just have a sentence that says, Mrs. Hartley is absent, so there's a substitute teacher. You need to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion of the statement and then rewrite it using an if and a then. So, figure out what you need to know first, the hypothesis. Well, Miss Hartley being absent is going to be our hypothesis, and what would come from that, what would be concluded for our conclusion, is that there would be a substitute teacher. All right, so we'll just go ahead and put that in an if-then. So if Miss Hartley is absent, then there will be a substitute teacher. So you can change the words a little bit so it sounds a little bit more grammatically correct. So I didn't say then there is a substitute teacher, then there will be. That is not a big deal, but or else you should keep the sentence as similar to the original form that it was. You just need to put it in that if-then form. All right, go ahead and flip your page. All right, we also have counterexamples. Counterexamples are an example that shows the conditional statement is false. Okay, so we are going to try to prove a statement wrong. Let's practice. Is the conditional below true or false? If false, give a counterexample. That's how you'll see a lot of these problems. So the statement says, if a number is divisible by 3, then it is odd. Is that true or false? Take a minute to think about it. All right, that is false. You could have come up with any counterexamples you want to, as long as they work for the statement. All right, so for instance, I thought of the number 6. 6 because it's even and divisible by 3. All right, so 6 divided by 3 is 2, so it is divisible by 3, but it's even, so that proves the statement wrong. Some other examples you could have thought of were 12, 18, 24, so on, all right? But you just need one counterexample to prove something wrong. Once you come up with a counterexample, that conditional is false. So that kind of gets us into truth value. All right, so we've got our conditional original, we've got our converse, inverse, and contrapositive for this statement about angle A. We're going to determine whether that is true. And look at this little note down here. Thinking of a counterexample helps, all right? So whenever you see a statement, try to think of how you can show that it is false. And if you can't think of anything, then it's probably true. So let's start. Conditional. If the measure of angle A is 15, then angle A is acute. Well, if angle A is 15 degrees, that's less than 90 degrees, so that's acute, so that's true. All right? The other options would be a right angle or an obtuse, and 15 degrees does not fall into those categories. All right? Converse. If angle A is acute, then the measure of angle A is 15 degrees. Well, what about an acute angle that's 16 degrees, or 1 degree, or 89 degrees? Those are still acute angles, which is our hypothesis, but they're not 15 degrees. I could come up with counterexamples, so that is false. Inverse. We have the same order as our original. The A equals 15 is first, and acute part is second, but we've got those nots in there. Okay, so if the measure of angle A is not 15, then angle A is not acute. Well, if it's not 15, maybe it is 16 degrees again. And is that still acute? Yes, it is. So there's another counterexample. And the last one, contrapositive. If A is not acute, then the measure of angle A is not 15. Well, if it's not acute, yeah, so if A is not acute, Well, then you have to be larger, 90 degrees or larger, so it cannot be 15. So that is true. There's no counterexample for that. All right? And last thing, you've got some other symbols that might be used, like the symbols we used on the front with our types of conditionals. You might see this upside down V. That means and. So you see P and Q right here, read as P and Q. You may also see the one that looks like a V, and that is or. So you have P or Q, read as P or Q. All right? A good way to remember that is the and one kind of looks like an A. All right? And then or is the other one. The last one you need to know is therefore. That is those 3 dots in the form of a triangle. So you would see it like this, and it's read as P, therefore Q. All right? Go ahead and bring in these notes completed into class. We'll see you next time.